Good morning, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Here we are in the birth narratives. I think this is session 5 that we're in. I will try and make this one a little briefer because I want you to be doing some homework. And your homework is simple. It's just to read the birth narratives, Matthew 1 and 2, and then, of course, 3 and 4 of Matthew in order to see the whole introduction to the gospel. Again, making sure that you connect Jesus and John the Baptist in the same manner Matthew does, because Luke is going to connect them differently. And then you'll, of course, read Luke 1 and 2. And you'll have, at that point, a relatively good feel for Luke's birth narrative. A couple of things as we begin here. We will come back to Matthew a bit, but I want to remind you now of several kind of conclusions that we can draw. The first is that Matthew's birth narrative is a redemptive pattern for the Hanukkah worldview that includes the fallen angels. Okay, and we see a reversal of much that takes place in the Hanukkah worldview. We saw that with regard to the inclusion of the 4 women in the genealogy of Jesus, the use of illicit arts, both by the women and the Magi. We see this in particular, this kind of overturning of the Hanukkah worldview, now with the virgin birth as opposed to these angelic spirits who have sexual intercourse with women and create Nephilim. Real contrast there. We have the influence of both the Abraham and the David figures right from the get-go in the opening prologue to the gospel. And we have, of course, the allusions back to Moses in the flight from Egypt, flight to Egypt, and the Herod persecuting the children, like Pharaoh would slaughter the infants. So we have these connections back to these great figures of Israel's history and to show, and the writer includes these fulfillment citations, these fulfillment formulae, in order to fulfill that catchphrase. To show that, in fact, all of this history of Israel, and that Jesus is the culmination of this history. That's all right, Mark. Good morning. And yeah, well, I haven't quite caught up with myself either. I just enjoy studying and then thinking out loud about things from all the different places I'm coming from. Yeah, but good morning. Okay, so we have all of this to take into consideration with Matthew. We've talked about the larger worldview of Matthew, the issues that he's dealing with post Second Temple. Now we're in the just emerging phases of what will become Rabbinic Judaism, and then Talmudic Judaism. So we've tried to also look at the figure of Moses, the question of whether the 5 discourses in Matthew are kind of a new Torah. We've talked about Matthew's orientation to the Torah a wee bit, just a small bit. We have just barely mentioned, I know I maybe have mentioned it once in glancing, but that Matthew has a real pro-Petrine or pro-Peter type rendering of Mark, and whenever Mark has the disciples looking dumb and stupid and Peter looking bad, of course Matthew kind of edits that out or makes them look better. We have a lot of that going on in Matthew's community, shoring up this Jerusalem church thinking. And we've seen that Matthew's gospel both contributes to, and also because of the influence of the Jesus tradition, is deconstructing the process of how the Gentiles are included. I would say for the Matthean community, they are still wrestling with this larger question of kosher Sabbath and circumcision, even as late as 75. Who constitutes true Judaism? Do Gentiles need to become Jews in order to become Christians? And then, of course, we are really left with kind of a stunning mystery between the time the Gospel of Matthew is written and the Gentile Ignatius is the bishop in the beginnings of the 2nd century, and what happened to this community in the meantime. And of course, all of that would be at this point speculation, but some of it could be decent. You never know. Okay, so when you come to Luke's narrative, now we've talked about Matthew. Let's talk about Luke. Rather than jumping into Luke's worldview, Luke has a very specific agenda in both the Gospel and in Acts. Luke is writing as a historian in the ancient world, and what that means is different than a historian who writes today. There's a similarity. Both ancient and modern historians are concerned for the facts, that is, what happened. Both the ancient and the modern historian don't go making up facts. They have to interpret facts, and so in that sense there's no such thing as raw data. All data is interpreted. I mean, this is something we know now from hermeneutics. There's no such thing as a past event, or an event even in and of itself. Even an event that's witnessed is interpreted. That which is seen through the eyes of one person may not be the exact same thing that's seen through the eyes of another who may be seeing other things, and on and so on and so forth. So there's no such thing as raw data. All history is interpreted history. You have to know this. All history is interpreted history, whether ancient or modern. So, for example, you can read JFK and the Unspeakable by James Douglas, and there Douglas is going to actually get in and gut out using reams of data. I don't know that other researchers have used to demonstrate who really and what really got JFK killed. Was his opposition, growing opposition to the Vietnam War, and his desire to pull troops out in summer and early fall of 1963. It's a fascinating book to read, but it's a revision of a lot of the history. And of course, the first history we ever had of what happened came from the Warren Commission, the government commission in the 1960s. Well, you know, history is malleable, isn't it? It all depends, A, upon the evidence or the growing body of evidence or the evidence made available, but it also depends on the interpreter, okay? Now, with Luke as an ancient writer, he's going to follow, as a good writer, we're going to see in a moment how skilled he is, how literary he is. Luke is, I mean, all the gospel writers in their own way are they're geniuses, and they're all seeking to work out the importance of Jesus for both Israelite and world history, both of them. I'm sorry, both of them, all four of them, the canonical gospel writers, both of them. Yeah, I only have two gospels, man. I'm double Marcionite. Okay. Each of them is a genius in their own way. If you followed my series on the Gospel of John, you'll see how I see that writer just weaving a tapestry with words and allusions everywhere. Well, the same thing is true as we seen with regard to Matthew, or Matthew's midrashic technique. Mark has his own style, and Luke will also have his own style. Again, I'm going to use Luke here for convenience sake. Whether or not this is the companion of Paul, I will just leave totally open and not bother. That it is a Pauline perspective is unquestionable. That Luke, the writer of this gospel, is a Paulinist. Pro-Paul is unquestionable for two reasons. You could say this. One is Luke and Acts are written by the same author, even though it was debated for a little while in the 20th century whether or not we had the same writer. Henry Cadbury put that thing to rest back in the 20s or 30s, I think, that we are indeed dealing with the same writer, linguistically, stylistically, etc. You know that Paul is the hero of the book of Acts, and that there's a Peter-Paul comparison, and Paul, of course, is going to win the day, as it were. It's the Pauline message that is very, very important for Luke. Now, in the same way, you have Jesus, John the Baptist in this gospel, also making that same break that you do Paul in the Jerusalem church in the book of Acts. You want to keep these kinds of things in mind. Now, a couple of things you want to keep in mind about the writer of Luke, and I've already mentioned this, is I believe I did in, I should say, I mention things all the time. This would be in last Sunday's sermon. I talked about Luke's travel section, 9:51 to 18:14. That section of Luke where he uses the theme of the rejected prophet like Moses. And David Mosner in his book Lord of the Banquet has laid out, it's how this theme just gets played out over and over and over, that what we have in Jesus is the rejected prophet like Moses. Moses is rejected. We saw the rejection theme in Matthew, we've seen it in John, we see it in Mark. I mean, we see it in Paul. The rejection of Jesus looms large in the New Testament, folks, and we need to take that as seriously today as the early communities did, because Jesus is largely rejected within Christendom as well. So if you open your Bible to Luke and you're reading in English, you'll read in as much as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things which have just been accomplished among us, just as they were delivered to us by those who from the beginning were witnesses and servants of the word. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the truth concerning the things of which you've been informed. And then, boom, in the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah. You have two very, very different Greek styles here. Verses 1 through 4 are literary Greek, and they are the kind of introduction that you would find at the beginning of ancient histories, like you'd find at the beginning of Josephus, or ancient classical Greek historians, Xenophon and others. Joel Green, in his excellent commentary on Luke, has also noted that the way that Luke writes these first 4 verses is directly in line with the ancient rhetorical traditions of seeking to persuade a reader, and why this is being written this way. So there's a lot to say about these 4 verses. I mean, you could spend hours on these first 4 verses trying to divine out what Luke's intentions and motives were. I just want to call attention to a few things. The difference in style. Greek of those who really are fluent with the language. Then you have your Koine. I mean, literary Greek's Koine as well, but it's literary. There's the use of all kinds of syntactical and stylistical flourishes and touches that are used. Koine, regular Koine. Then you have this what we call Septuagint Greek, which is the translation Greek of the Old Testament. That is, when the Old Testament was translated into Greek, and it's a process, and there are a number of traditions, manuscript traditions in this, so don't go thinking Septuagint's translated once, all at one time. No, it's translated over time, and there are various textual traditions with regard to the Septuagint. The Septuagint has its own style of Greek, and what happens, it's like if I'm speaking German or French, my German or French will, that is, the hearer can figure out what I'm saying, but it's not really true German or true French because I'm thinking in English syntax. And so it comes out German words, but English phrasing, okay? And those of you that have had to try and speak German or French with me know very well that reading it is one thing, but having an ear and a tongue for it is a completely different thing. Now, Luke shifts to this Septuagint style here, and it's full of what we're going to call, or what scholars call, Semitisms. A Semitism is a phrase in Greek that reflects Hebrew idiom or syntax. Let me give you a great example. In Greek, ho huios tu anthropou, literally, the son of the man. That's terrible Greek. You might have the son of a man, ho huios anthropou. You could have son of this man, the article functioning as a demonstrative, huios tu anthropou, you know. But ho huios tu anthropou, that's not good Greek at all. But it does reflect this, the Hebrew phrasing of the way that it's the Septuagintal phrasing of Ben Adam or Bar Nasha in Aramaic. There's this kind of awkward Greek phrase. You find that in the Gospels. The phrase and Jesus began to teach is a Semitism. The Greek writer would just simply, and Jesus taught, or Jesus was teaching, but and began to is a Semitism. So once you hit verse 5, you're all of a sudden back in the language, the intentional language, perhaps, of the Greek Old Testament. That is, Luke's dropped you right into that world. He could have written this, think about this now, he could have written this text in very polished literary Greek, right? But he's such a good writer that in order to capture the ethos of the content of the narrative, that is, the temple in Jerusalem, a priest making an offering, angels, he goes right into that style. I don't know about other languages, but in English, the writer that I think best did this, of any novelist, was Louis de Bergerac. He wrote Corelli's Mandolin. That's the book, Corelli's Mandolin. It's a terrible film. Don't waste your time with the film. Read the book. In that book, he does various characters as they're telling a chapter, each chapter from their perspective, right? And you can go through chapters and not have any idea who the character is that's speaking, but it's happening all around them. You have to carry that into subsequent chapters until you finally go, oh, I know who this character is that's speaking. It's a brilliant book that way. Corelli's Mandolin by Louis de Bergerac, I think is how you pronounce his last name. I don't recall. Okay, Luke's doing the same thing. He's adopting a style, and that's to bring his narrative reader, Theophilus, and of course the larger Christian community into this ethos of Second Temple Judaism. And that style will continue up until chapter 3, when you begin to get koine. At that point, Luke will write just standard koine, but there will be, throughout this gospel, more Semitisms. I want to talk to you about the importance of that for a moment, and why this is important. So the first thing I want to point out to you comes from the book, The Hebrew Gospel and the Development of the Synoptic Tradition by James Edwards. This book did a lot for me. It helped clear up a number of issues, particularly because I reject Q, that is the construct of scholars that the material common to Matthew and Luke comes from an oral or perhaps a written tradition known as Q. I don't buy that. It's not a workable hypothesis for me, and that's all it is a hypothesis, even though there's a regular cottage industry around it, and scores of books, and people actually believe that it's real. This is so funny. Scholars, man, they say you can't have faith, but they have faith in Q. It's not real. At any rate, one of the things that Edwards does is to go through the gospel. And I'll try and get this so you can see it. And he goes through, I don't know if you can read this or not. Is it too close? I'm trying to get it there. Sorry, peeps. Maybe you can, I don't know how close you can read it, but you'll notice he goes through, this is like chapter 1:3 to 2 something, and he shows all the Semitisms, okay? And this is his observation after he goes through the entirety of the gospel. There are 703 Semitisms listed above. That's how many he's counted in Luke's gospel, 703. 505 occur in material found only in special Luke. That is material that's not found in Mark or found in Matthew. That's material only found in Luke. Saying narratives only found in Luke. 505 of these Semitisms come from special Luke. 148 more occur as Lucan additions to Matthew and or Mark. Thus, a total of 653 are unique to Luke. We're dealing with a writer here who has absorbed the gospel tradition in quite a Semitic fashion. Now, what's the conclusion Edwards draws? Well, he goes through and he argues that, in fact, what you have is the use of a Hebrew gospel. I'm looking very quickly. Here's his chart. I don't know if you can read this. Let's see if I can get it up straight. So you'll notice that he has Luke. Luke's sources are the Hebrew gospel, what he calls Q, double tradition meaning Q. He doesn't call it Q because he doesn't want to give Q credence, and the Gospel of Mark. Matthew's three sources are additional sources behind just Matthew, Mark, and Q. You see, this is the standard frame. I think Luke has edited Matthew. So I would go Matthew's midrash on Mark, including all his special material, and then Luke borrowing from Mark, Matthew, and the Hebrew gospel. So I eliminate the double tradition there, place that over into Matthew's gospel, and that's how I would do it. Okay. On the assumption that Luke is rewriting Matthew, and I did take that position back in 2002 and 3 and 4 when I was writing the commentary on Luke and the Preaching Peace website. At that time, I wasn't as convinced as my partner was, who introduced me to this, and we talked it through a lot, Jeff Krantz, but eventually I've become persuaded of the larger hypothesis. So Luke's going to undertake to write a narrative. What he says about this is he says, I want to write an orderly account for you. Now, I need you just to think for a moment about this, because orderly account doesn't mean chronological. That's not what it refers to. Yes, chronology is important, but not like we think. An orderly account is an account that makes sense. Thinking this through, there is a rift in the early church between Jerusalem Christianity and Paul. That rift is evidenced in Antioch. Mark's gospel, written in 70, 71, 72, right in that time frame, after the death of the apostles, frames the gospel. There are certain Pauline themes in that gospel. And the reality is the disciples don't come out looking good in Mark's gospel. If Matthew has rewritten Mark for his own community, he has brought Jesus more in line with Judaism, particularly Second Temple Messianic types of belief systems. He's also perhaps influenced with a certain anti-Pauline element in his gospel, and commentators have noticed that there's almost an anti-libertarian emphasis, and some have even said there's an anti-Pauline element. I suspect that it's there. I don't know that it looms large in Matthew's gospel, but it certainly is an underlying reality for Matthew, as he's writing his text. If Luke, as a Paulinist, reads Mark's gospel, then reads Matthew's gospel in his community, and knowing the ongoing tribulations of post-apostolic Christianity, okay? Remember, Jewish Christianity has begun its fragmentation into the East, its flight to Pella, its flight to Syria, to Iraq. The Jewish Christians are going to go where there are Jewish communities, and they do, into Babylon, into into Iraq, Iran, down into Egypt, where there's a large Jewish community, the largest in the ancient world, 250,000 in Alexandria. You have this enormous Jewish presence in the ancient world. There's the Jewish Christians are going to go where the Semitic tongues are spoken. Gentile Christianity beginning to flourish. Already we see this in Rome. I mean, again, once Jerusalem falls, you have to understand Jewish Christians. There's a lot to lose for them in the ancient world, particularly if they are expats. So if you're a Jewish Christian, you're living in Rome. I'm sorry, if you're just Jewish living in Rome, and Rome is battling the Jews in your homeland, how are you going to be perceived? Of course, not very well. And there have been already mass bootings of Jews in the previous decades, expelling the Jews from Rome. Certainly, Luke records one of those in the book of Acts. Gentiles would then become the dominant group in the early church, and we already see that happening in this post-apostolic period, of which we really know so very, very little. It's as though there's a ghost in the machine from the time of Paul's letters, really until the 2nd century, with Ignatius and Polycarp and then Justin Martyr. I mean, there's big gaps. And it becomes interesting then to realize part of the filling in of these gaps is this gospel tradition that's written between 70 and 90. And then, of course, some of the later New Testament literature, like the pastorals, Timothy and Titus, and the book of Acts, that are written in the certainly the second half of the second decade of the 2nd century, 115 to 120. 2 Peter's written then as well. So you have this development of Christianities, and the Gospels, I think, can give us a window into post-apostolic Christianity, particularly if we see the emergence of Pauline Christianity with the Gospel of Mark, the Eastern revision of that in Antioch in Matthew, and then, in a sense, the Western revision of the whole kit, bang, and caboodle by Luke using 3 sources: Mark, Matthew, and the Hebrew Gospel. And so he says, as many as have undertaken to compile a narrative of things which have been accomplished or happened among us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all these things closely for some time, to write an orderly account for you. And he's going to write an account. Again, the focus isn't so much chronological, that's not the issue here, as theological. And that's why Luke is writing. Now, another thing to observe is that Luke, in these birth narratives, makes a much more intimate connection between Jesus and John the Baptist than the writer of Matthew did. For the writer of Matthew, the birth narrative is focused entirely on Jesus, and then John the Baptist is mentioned in chapter 3, and the Jesus-Baptist connection is made, and we carry on from there. Luke's tied these two much more intimately. He's turned them into cousins, as it were, family. And with this parallelism between Jesus and John the Baptist, you might be tempted to say, oh, look, Luke is showing the connection between Jesus and the Baptist the same way the writer of Matthew wants us to understand Jesus and the Baptist. That is, they're both preaching the same message. Except Luke has that vivid break between Jesus and the Baptist in chapter 7. A break reflected perhaps historically as well in John chapter 4, where Jesus and John are doing simultaneous baptismal ministries. But there is a break between Jesus and the Baptist, because there is a break in the worldview, friends. There's a break in this concept of the reign of God for Jesus from John the Baptist, because for Jesus, this whole business of recompense and judgment, economies of exchange, gets taken right out of the picture. So even as Luke is connecting Jesus and John the Baptist in these birth narratives, it's only to really show the severe distinction between the two. A distinction manifested, of course, in Acts 19, where certain believers in Ephesus only have the baptism of John. And so then Paul has to preach and they get the Holy Spirit. Well, what does it mean they only knew the baptism of John? These followers of the way of the Lord, that is the Jesus way, are still following John within this framework of Second Temple, Hanukkah days of judgment and recompense that John talks about. And Paul has to go, no, that's not how it is. And when they do, then they get the Spirit. They learn the Jesus way. There is a distinction between Jesus and John the Baptist, just as there's a connection. You have to connect the two. Every single gospel writer does. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, every single one of them connect Jesus to the Baptist. But Luke and John in particular show the enormous difference between Jesus and the Baptist. For Mark, the difference is not accentuated, and the Baptist simply functions as kind of a precursor to the Passion narrative. And that, you know, and we see that same kind of thinking in Matthew 23, where the Matthean Jesus says, look, you know, your fathers, they laud the prophets that died, but castigate their fathers for killing the prophets, but they do the same thing. Again, the theme of rejection looms large here in the gospel tradition. Okay. When the gospel, and because the gospel is rejected, and this is another thing you really got to get through your heads. People aren't going to like the gospel, because the gospel is so outside our way of thinking. Once you eliminate judgment and recompense, the day of judgment and recompense, once you take you're going to burn in hell forever out of the equation, people freak out, because the only worldview they know is that Second Temple worldview. Okay, and the gospel is a direct deconstruction of that. That's what's really happening here. That's why apocalyptic is no longer in the future. It has taken place on the cross. That's Paul, that's the writer of John, that's Luke. So as you move through these birth narratives, one of the things that I found very, very helpful in Joel Green's commentary, and it's a great commentary, you know, you only really need, let me do an excursus here, you only really need 3 excellent commentaries on each book that you're studying. Okay, 3 excellent commentaries. And what's an excellent commentary? An excellent commentary is a commentary that engages the Greek text. Even if you don't read Greek, you want to read the scholars that are reading the Greek text, okay? You can learn enough Greek to be able to pronounce the word that the scholar is referring to, okay? And you might learn enough to be able to use, say, a lexicon, okay? Stay away from Thayer's and Strong's, people. You know how I feel about those things, okay? I'm talking about doing the right thing, using the right resources. 3 critical commentaries. That's really all you need. So if you were to say, Michael, what 3 would you use with regard to Luke? Well, you know, right now, the 3 I'm using for this particular study are Joel Green, I. Howard Marshall, and Frederick Denker. Those are the 3 I'm using. I'll dip into Edward Schweitzer later and a few others. Fitzmyer, of course, brilliant work. Finest, one of the finest commentaries out there, Fitzmyer. But I've used Fitzmyer a lot in the past, and I wanted to dip around a bit as I'm doing my exploring here, preparing for these lessons. So those would be the 3 I would use for Luke. Frederick Denker's Jesus in the New Age. Here, I'll show it to you. You can find it on, all this stuff's on Amazon. Okay, Jesus in the New Age, a commentary on St. Luke's Gospel. If you need to go back through and pause and then, you know, get the completely revised and expanded edition, much better. Here's I. Howard Marshall's New International Commentary on the Greek New Testament. Okay. And Joel Green I have as an electronic copy. Okay. Now, having set you up for this, I want to talk a little bit about Luke's editorial activities. And I want to show you something about Luke as a writer. Luke chunks things together from his sources. Remember that travel narrative, 951 through 1814, that big section in the middle. There's no Mark there. Luke is following all his own stuff, or Matthew at that point, or Q if you're into all that nonsense. Okay, that's special material. So this is from Joachim Jeremias' New Testament Theology, and I'll try and get this close enough. There are 3 columns, and the first column, let me see if I can do this so you can see. Okay, we'll look at the other page in a moment. Can you all see this? I hope so. New material, Luke 1 through 2:21. And then you'll notice after that is Mark material. So Luke next goes to Mark, and then we'll turn the page here. And then again, you have special material Luke, then Luke follows Mark, special material Luke, Luke follows Mark, special material Luke, Luke follows Mark, special material Luke, Luke follows Mark. Do you see that chunking that Luke does? He just chunks it out. So when he says he's going to write an orderly account, you know, again, this is not about chronology. It's about putting the sources together in such a way that certain theological themes can be emphasized. I'll conclude this with this thought experiment for you. Go read the Luke and birth narratives. Luke 1, 1, and 2 before tomorrow. I'll probably jump back into this tomorrow. I'm really enjoying this very much. Read the Luke and birth narratives, and then here's the question I want to ask you. How is redemption framed? Ask yourself about how is redemption framed. I'll give you one example. In the Magnificat of Mary in chapter 1, you have Mary saying, and this again is a way that the redemption is framed. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. He has put down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of low degree. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. What kind of frame of redemption is that? Is that not very Hanukkah worldview? Absolutely it is. Okay, I want you to go through this Luke and birth narrative, and I want you to look at these songs in particular. Zechariah's song, Mary's song, Simeon's song, and ask yourself, how is redemption framed? And then ask this one question. After you've gone and you've done that experiment, then go and say, does any of this happen in the rest of the gospel? Okay? So that's your work for tomorrow. You're going to go through and you're going to say, in these narratives, particularly the songs, the 3 songs are going to give you the clues. How is redemption framed? Second, how much of that happens in the rest of the gospel? You with me? Okay, so that's your work for tomorrow. Hope you've enjoyed today, and let me wish everybody a fine Monday. Peace and love. I have some new things coming in the classroom here, and some friends have thought of some things so that we can begin figuring out ways to get this message out. And I'll look forward to your thoughts on that. Anyway, peace and love. Keep studying these birth narratives. Christmas is coming, and you really, when Christmas comes, you should be so richly endowed inside and out in these birth narratives and in these Gospels that you will feel the kind of celebration that the shepherds felt. That's really the goal here. You will really, reading these narratives will bring you great joy in this Christmas season. So that's why I'm seeking to help you read them. All right, Steph, you just joined, buddy. I'm just leaving, man. Peace and love, babe. Read your essay, and I'll send you the feedback. Very nice. Nicely done. Second job. Nicely done. All right, man. Peace and love, peeps. Cheers. Bye now.